That is wrong. That is absolutely wrong. Not good enough. Okay, so clickbait aside, Game Maker's Toolkit is a phenomenal channel which covers a lot of game design critique and analysis style videos. I'm a big fan of the channel, but recently started a new series about game development, and specifically he's using Unity to make his first game. And the first video that he's released, the title is How I Learned Unity Without Following Tutorials. And that's especially interesting to me as I'm a professional game developer with about 7 years of experience using Unity as part of my day job. And I learned how to use Unity in large part due to video tutorials. So maybe I'm doing something wrong, or maybe Mark is doing something wrong. So if he's right, I want to amplify his message. And if he's wrong, I want to warn you guys about not making the same kind of mistake. Let's see what he has to say. All right, so immediately starts with really high production values, exactly what we've come to expect from GMTK. And he's telling his story. I'm excited to see what happened.
The first thing I had to do was to pick a game engine.
Wrong. The first thing you have to do is pick what game you want to make and then select a game engine that can make the game that you want to make. Like, for example, if you want to make a 3D game, then you shouldn't learn a 2D game engine like Game Maker Studio, because obviously it's not going to allow you to make the game that you actually want to make.
A piece of software that helps you make a game by essentially taking care of the stuff that's hard and boring.
52 seconds in, he said, it takes care of all the stuff that's hard and boring if you use a game engine. Oh my goodness, Mark, you are in for a hell of a journey. I promise you that, my friend, because no, it doesn't take care of all the hard and boring stuff. First of all, there are a lot of engine programmers out there who would argue with you that what they do is actually the fun stuff. But leaving them aside, most of us people who got into games because we wanted to make games, yeah, okay, we'll agree that maybe making the engine is not the most interesting thing in the world. But if you think it makes it easy, you're mistaken, my friend, because making a game is incredibly freaking hard. Most people, they make their first game, it's absolute garbage. Or they don't even finish the game. I'm sorry, but it doesn't make it easy. It doesn't take care of all the hard stuff. It's going to be hard either way. You can do it. If you try, you can do it, but it's still very hard.
I decided to go with Unity.
He's decided to use Unity, which is a great choice because he wants to make both 2D and 3D games, and he's found that it's the easiest thing to learn because there's so much content and so many resources out there available. Now, the problem is not all of those resources are very good. A lot of these people don't necessarily know what they're doing, or they don't necessarily have the best tutorial style. Like, for example, a lot of these tutorials don't even tell you what the prerequisite level of knowledge is for someone to start using that tutorial. And so if I'm an absolute beginner and I watch the tutorial, or I'm an expert and I watch the tutorial, I'm going to have a very different experience depending on who that tutorial is for. And they never tell you this. So while there's a lot of information, it can also be really overwhelming, which is what I had experienced myself.
I went onto YouTube, I typed in Unity tutorials and found a bunch of Swedish men who could teach me how to use the software.
Swedish men. He's talking about Brackeys, and then also, what's his face? The dude who made the Bezier Path plugin for Unity. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, man. He just said he started using a bunch of Unity tutorials to learn Unity. So that kind of goes against the title of the video, which says, How I Learned Unity Without Following Tutorials. I guess he used them wrong, and that's why he had difficulty. Most people think, all right, I'm just going to watch the tutorial and then I'll learn. Well, no, that's wrong. You're not going to learn just by watching a tutorial. Then some people, they're a bit smarter. They think, of course you can't just learn just by watching a tutorial. I'm a lot smarter. I know what to do. I have to follow along with the tutorial. And that's enough to allow me to learn. That is wrong. That is absolutely wrong. Not good enough. As you're following along with the tutorial, stop and test your knowledge. You need to make a hypothesis. Go, if I change this line of code, what is going to happen? Here's what I think is going to happen. Then you change it, and then you test it, and you see what actually happens. Was it what you thought was going to happen? Well, then you understood. If not, why did something else happen? Look it up. Figure out why your hypothesis was wrong. And then once you actually are able to hypothesize about what is going to happen with the code, when you change it, that's when you know that you have actually gained understanding, all right? You need to play with the code in order to learn how to code, all right? You cannot learn without playing because it is an interactive tool. You have to play, and that will allow you to turn that information that you're receiving from the tutorial into actual knowledge that will stick with you for the rest of your life.
I followed along diligently. Every time they clicked a box, I click that box on my screen. And every time they typed out a line of code, I type out the same line of code.
Yeah, so he's making the exact mistake that I told you not to make, but let's see if he's learned from it.
Everything they had said had gone in one ear and out the other. I couldn't even make a character appear on the screen and move around. It was terrible. But to be honest, this was really demoralizing. I truly felt like an idiot. I had wasted weeks of my life and I didn't know if I was even cut out for game development at all.
This is a big problem. A lot of people get demoralized because something is hard and then you fail or you like make a game that's not very good and it's really, really tough to stick with it. But listen, if you do stick with it, you will learn. Nothing in life is easy. Like these artists who become really good at art, do you think they just started out and they were drawing amazing things? No, they drew a bunch of really, really shitty things for like 10,000 hours and then they became amazing at some point. Game development is actually a bit easier, I would say, because you can start out and you just grind at it over and over and you do as many iterations as possible and eventually it becomes good, even if you yourself are not that amazing of a game developer. But after you make your first couple of games, which are probably going to be, terrible, you'll eventually make something that you can be proud of.
But then I thought about Adobe Premiere. This is the software that I use to make all the videos on this channel. A colleague taught me the basics of Adobe Premiere, like just the absolute baseline knowledge you need to make a video.
Almost like your colleague gave you a tutorial.
So perhaps I can take my 3-step structure, basics, familiarize, experiment, and apply it to Unity.
He's using his knowledge of how he learned Premiere and applying that to how to learn Unity, which is a great idea. If you've ever learned some kind of tool in the past, then you kind of already know how to teach yourself how to learn that tool. But the thing is, maybe you're 13 years old. Maybe you've never learned how to use a tool on your own. Maybe that's difficult for you. And so you need an actual process. And so tutorials are not completely useless. They can still give you a little bit of structure. And the nice thing about using a tutorial is that you get a little bit of structure, then you play around with it, you experiment, and you go back to what the tutorial person had, now with a much greater knowledge of what's actually going on, and then you follow along some more, and now you get introduced to new information. And so I don't think that tutorials are really as bad as he's trying to make them seem, like, oh, you can never learn everything in one go. Of course you can't learn everything in one go, but I don't know of any tutorial that tries to teach you how to learn everything in one go. Most of them teach you like how to make Pong. It's really, really simple stuff. I appreciate the fact that you were able to learn from your own experience learning Premiere, but you need to understand not everyone watching your channel even has that experience learning any piece of software that's really quite complicated.
Okay, so luckily I'm not starting completely from zero when it comes to game development. I am familiar with the fundamentals of programming, or at least that's what it said on my Tinder profile, so I know about if statements and for loops and functions and stuff like that. And I have dabbled in Game Maker, so I kind of get how game engines work.
He's starting out ahead of a lot of the people who are trying to learn, even if his basic process, which is learn the basics and then familiarize yourself and then experiment. That stuff I think is all very good. Of course, you need to learn the basics and familiarize and experiment, but the tutorial gives you a structure with which to do that. It introduces the basics to you. It allows you to familiarize yourself with them and experiment with them, kind of like what I said. You learn by playing with it. You get access to the information from the tutorial itself. Now you can try to read the documents, but if you're just starting from scratch, reading the documents is going to be challenging for you. You can try to search for stuff, but if you're just starting from scratch, again, searching for stuff is going to be hard for you. The tutorial itself is going to introduce you to those basics that are really that first step in the process that Mark Brown is describing in his video.
A game object is basically like an invisible container with a position, rotation, and scale, which you can then fill with components to make it do stuff.
Oh man, I don't want to be an asshole, but the game, he's conflating the game object with the transform, and every game object has a transform component, but the transform component is not the same thing as the game object, but sure, it's fine.
So then I use tutorials and Google and talking to people to kind of answer those questions and figure out the basics of Unity.
So you use tutorials and Google and talking to people to get the answers to those questions. And yet you say you learned how to use Unity without following tutorials, despite you clearly used tutorial. I'm sorry, man, your thesis doesn't align with what you're saying in the video.
And sure, there are probably plenty of Unity people watching this right now who think that is not a very comprehensive list. That is not going to get you very far.
I think that your list was actually pretty good. I mean, for someone who's making their first game, you don't need to learn about like the details of how Unity's serialization system works to make your first game. All right, like you just need to know how to make game objects and make them move around and interact with each other. Like that's really the basics of it. So I think you covered plenty of stuff that you would actually want to make your first game. I think it's fine.
Prove that I understand those things and to really familiarize myself with them by copying really simple games.
So about 11 minutes and 30 seconds in, this is a really good idea. The first game that I made was just a clone of Pong. And I learned how to do this from one of the Swedish men that Mark was talking about earlier, Brackies. And it was a really weird tutorial because it was a JavaScript tutorial that I had used. And yes, I use tutorials. Sorry, Mark Brown, I use tutorials, okay? It was a JavaScript tutorial, but I wanted to learn how to do it in C#. So I was going along with the tutorial, translating from JavaScript to C#. That basically forced me to experiment and understand exactly what I was doing, because how are you supposed to translate from one programming language to another if you don't know what that code is actually doing? I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but it is something that you can do.
There are tutorials out there for how to make Flappy Bird in Unity. There's about 10,000 of them, but I didn't want to use them. I wanted to do it by myself.
Some people might not have that knowledge. They don't know what an if statement is. They don't know what a for loop is, and they need that tutorial. A little bit of structure in the form of a tutorial to introduce you to the stuff that you're trying to learn is really quite important for people.
This felt amazing. I know it looks dreadfully unimpressive. Like, well done, jackass. You stole the most simple game ever made. I hope you're proud of yourself. But I'm proud of myself.
You should be proud of yourself. This is amazing, dude. Like, a lot of people never even get to this point. All right, they follow the tutorial and they never get to the point where they actually are able to think of their own game idea and implement it. Or in this case, think of a game idea that someone's already made and implement it for themselves. It's hard to do, and it's great that you've managed to do this.
The process was pretty much the same. Play the game and kind of reverse engineer it to get a sort of quasi-design document.
Obviously, this is a skill that Mark Brown has been developing for the past 7 years while he's been reverse engineering games to analyze them and breaking them down on his channel. But if you're trying to make your own game, one of the best things you can do to improve your skills as a game designer is to actually break down other people's games. Watching Game Maker's Toolkit videos is fun, but you kind of need to do that yourself and not just watch other people do it. Do it for yourself. Pick a game that you play and then try to break that down. And I would recommend starting with a really, really simple game and not something overly complicated. If you want to see an example of this, I have a video about the movement mechanic in Super Mario Brothers on my channel that I released years ago. But basically it breaks down every single little detail. And you don't necessarily need to go into that level of detail, but if you want to implement it, you kind of do. And so it really forces you to break stuff down. And so this is a great tool, by the way, to just learn game design as well. Regardless of whether you actually plan on turning that into your own copy of the game.
In Unity, you kind of use this thing called quaternions, which are like a 4-dimensional rotational axis, and my brain just kind of leaks out my ears when I try to read about them.
The game engine programmers have put that library in for you so that you don't need to 100% understand the inner workings of quaternions. You can use the built-in functions like angle axis to do the rotation for you.
Everyone learns in a different way, and maybe you do just like having someone explain things to you in a Swedish accent.
I will go further in Mark, and I will say, no, you will never learn how to make games properly if you just follow along with the tutorial. Never. Ever. It's not going to work for you. You need to, at some point, you need to take the training wheels off, and you need to experiment. You need to play around with it, and you can learn by playing. That's the only way. It is a highly complicated interactive tool, okay? If you don't interact with it, you will never learn how to use it. All right, so right at the end of the video, I think I want to summarize by saying, his strategy is not bad, but I think his strategy worked for him in particular because of two things. First of all, he had the experience learning another really complex tool like Premiere, which he had gone into detail about how he learned that, and he was able to carry over some of that knowledge on how to learn, which helped him learn Unity. Now, I've seen this before, by the way, in people that I've worked with. For example, I'm working with an artist right now, a really brilliant guy. So he went from Illustrator to C4D to Unity, and then he learned Blender as well. So once you learn how to learn programs, that is something that sticks with you, and you can keep on doing that for pretty much the rest of your life. However, I know also there are a lot of people who are starting out for the first time. Maybe you're just a young person. You haven't been exposed to a lot of this kind of really complex software. And so I don't necessarily think that's going to work for everyone. And the second reason why I think that it worked for Mark was because he already tried to make games in the past and he had failed. And you might think oh, well, I failed and that means that I don't know anything. But actually, this entire video is a story of how he learned from his failures, which was he started out just by trying to follow tutorials. And then it was too hard to actually take that and turn it into knowledge. I've already told you how you can take that information from a tutorial and turn it into knowledge, which is stop the tutorial. And then for every single line of code that you write, think, all right, what is this doing? Am I right about what it's doing? And test it, modify it, and see if that's actually what it's doing or not. And if that is what it's doing, then that's great, and you understand it. And then you can go to the next step, which is, all right, what if I want to change the functionality? What do I need to change? And you try to change it, and you see if that actually changes the functionality in the way that you thought it was going to change it. And if it does, that means that you have the understanding. If not, you've made some kind of mistake. So you play around with it over and over. Maybe you put on some Google searches why does this function do this when I give it this input? That is a really good way to learn. And then, of course, finally, you go back to the tutorial itself. You revert back your changes to the tutorial, and then you can move on to the next step together with the Swedish man in the tutorial, because now you have an understanding of everything that he has told you up until this point. And you can still stick to that overall tutorial structure, which I think has a lot of value for a lot of people, especially when you're just starting out. So I wouldn't say giving up on the tutorials is necessarily the best option, but certainly I think that a lot of the information that Mark has presented in his video is really good, and I wish him the best of luck in his game development endeavors. I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to make, man.